To achieve the rank of master, he completely shattered all outdated traditions of sword use. For his skill, people called him the greatest warrior of all time. A great hero, who was able to end a long civil war in the most powerful empire on the planet, Avalon. On the great continent, there's a hero, and that hero's name is Gene Saunders. He was the only one who possessed a large amount of magical power and a high level of martial arts at the same time. All of this made him a true killing machine. Unfortunately, an unworthy end awaited him. He was a loyal warrior of his kingdom, who was loyal to his king, after he and a band of the Empire's great heroes stopped a civil war. The other heroes felt that a man like Jin had no right to live. The thing is, they were afraid of him because in this world you either have magic or martial arts. Jin was the first person in history to combine the two. They thought he was cursed, because they thought that if he had been an ordinary person, someone of such power would have died long ago. When he asked why, they said they feared that after winning the war, he would want to get his hands on the throne. To the genie, it was absolute nonsense. He had never even had the thought of usurping the throne. Such a thing had never interested him. He just wanted to show the world the greatness of a weapon called a spear, and get rid of the sorrow of the closed circle. He only wanted to be a shield protecting his empire for the rest of his life. Wanted to help his emperor, his only close friend, to end a long civil war. When suddenly, the High Magician said, "Jin, understand there are people in the world whose existence is a great threat in itself. Now that the civil war is over, the emperor has risen to the highest office in which he can accomplish whatever he wishes without threat. And the only people he's afraid of is you, Jin. That's why you must die." Even warriors who have spent their entire lives training to master mana take a decade to apply mana on even a small dagger. But Jin has mastered a spear that is at least as strong as the two of them combined. He perfectly controls and manages his internal energy. He single-handedly defeated entire bands of professional rebels. It was for this reason that the Emperor considered him a threat to himself. And even after a tough battle and mana suppression, our hero still has enough energy left. But thanks to the ancient relic Angel's Eye, the High Magician suppressed Jin's magical power. This object was absorbing the magical Silogen without stopping, thus weakening it. And when Jin fell to the floor from exhaustion, the head of the Emperor's guard came up to him and said, "You are a great warrior, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool. I was afraid too. I was terribly afraid that just by looking at you, you'd stab me with that damn spear." Despite everything, they respected Jin to the core. Without him, they could hardly have won the war. But as always, after a war, there comes a period of dawn. And the Empire no longer needs warriors like Jin. Before stripping Jin of all magical energy, the High Magician leaned over to him and whispered, "Forgive me, and farewell, my old friend." When all the energy left our hero's body, he literally became paralyzed. His strength was so low that it was hard to even breathe. I mean, believe me, it wasn't easy for the Emperor to watch his old friend die either. But for the threat of the kingdom, it was a forced measure. Before his death, Jin gathered his remaining strength into a fist and shouted, "Caesar Ben Britain! Don't think this is the end. I'm coming for you and every one of you." And seeing that our hero was not dead from energy depletion, the Supreme Magician decided to finish him off. Since Jin himself possessed a high level of magic, he realized that it was an explosive circle. But to get outside of it, it's going to take Jin at least 5 minutes, so it's useless. Just like that, the greatest knight of all time became, in a matter of minutes, scum, who was eventually betrayed by a loyal friend and ended his life in a nameless wilderness. A bloody black stain, nicknamed the Reaper of the Battlefield, Rugia, our hero's faithful partner. How suddenly it began to glow. Jin knew there was a special power hidden in it, but he had no idea that he will manifest it in this moment, at the moment of death. That's it. This is the end of the story of the greatest warrior of all time. But he wasn't as scared of death as he was of being betrayed by his closest friend. Archduke of the Empire of Avalon, Land of Knights, Gene Saunders, met a futile end that didn't live up to his reputation as an invincible knight of the lance. But was this the end? After the explosion, Gene felt himself falling on something soft. Looking around, he saw a haystack, and all around there were lots of beautiful horses. And a fool knows he's in a stable. The last thing Jin remembered. There was a huge explosion, and his body began to tear apart. Well, his whole body was unharmed, not even a scratch. But the place where he found himself, it was familiar. And then he realized he was on the Emperor's old land, where he had worked as a boy. And when he saw his reflection in a bucket of ice water, he saw that he was a child again. And then he started putting all the facts together. The old farm he used to work on, and he was a kid again. which meant he had another chance. Jin decided that he would make the most of this chance, so that the ending of his life would be different. And the Emperor paid for what he had done. When suddenly, Jin's loneliness was interrupted by three guys dressed in old military uniforms. Suddenly one of them said, "What are you doing here? Why haven't you cleaned up the horse poop yet?" Though Jin remembered little from his childhood, these three he recognized. They were the Duke's personal guards. A guy with brown hair and a scar over his right eye got Lloyd. The blonde guy with the blue cape was a Rolls, and the guy with the russet hair was a Gort. All his childhood, Jin avoided talking to the three of them, pretending to be deaf and mute. He pretended he couldn't speak because if he opened his mouth it would get him in a lot more trouble. Suddenly, Gort shouted at the top of his voice, "Something. I haven't seen that Lucia for a long time. Don't worry, she's tumbling around in the bushes again." Hearing this, Rolls whispered in horror, "Shut your mouth, in case the Duke hears. He visits that maid from time to time." Jin completely forgot that since he's a kid again. He has a mom. I think it's worth explaining why the Duke periodically visits the common maid. Lucia was just an ordinary girl from an ordinary family. But she was insanely beautiful. Because of that, the Duke made her his personal maid. Over time, the Duke fell in love with her, and forced her to bear him a child. And so Jin was born. In other words, Jin was a bastard. Since the personal guards knew this, they viciously tortured him with noble blood and enjoyed it, especially those three standing right in front of him. He vowed to take revenge on them at all costs, even though the Duke loved Lucia. Everyone made fun of her, and the thing is, Duchess Vanessa said that even if someone got rid of Lucia and Jin without anyone knowing, she would take full responsibility. But since Lucy wasn't here, Lloyd and Rolls decided to just mess with the genie until she came back. But Jin is no longer the miserable and weak child he was then. He won't let those idiots who insulted his mother get away. But whether or not he'll be able to awaken his powers at such a young age, his body is still very weak. The mana technique he discovered in the ancient ruins with his favorite spear, Rugia. It was capable of reaching the peak of power in an instant because of the awesome impact that could shake the world. What was important was that the mana technique he had learned had a completely different method of robotics. It was not done by storing mana in the core, and by using mana from the world around you. It is literally not limited to a small plate called a mana core. In other words, Jin has learned to absorb mana with his entire body and from any object around him. It also concentrates mana where it is needed to splash it out instantly. Jin skipped the process of forming a mana core, which is necessary for anyone who uses mana. Thanks to that, he didn't spend a year curbing his power. Suddenly Gort shouted, "Let's punish him already, I'm filled with anger just looking at him." But despite the threat of a beating looming over him, Jin stood as still as a statue. The Duke's guards even thought he'd fainted from fear. But Jin was just trying to concentrate. Just a handful. All he needs is a handful of mana. Before his return, it had taken him 10 years to figure out how to curb even a tiny amount of mana. But now he knows how to do it. Now he does. Then these three can't just walk out of here? Suddenly, Jin knocked Gert to the ground with a single blow. As a child, he'd thought they were incredibly strong, but a tiny drop of mana was enough to take down a big guy like that. After applying mana, Jin felt something sticky and disturbing, right where the mana core should be. But Jin's should be empty, because he's never felt anything like this before. When he saw Jin knock out Gort, Lloyd drew his sword and shouted, "You must be crazy to want to die so badly. It's dangerous to go up against a trained soldier with a child's body." But if he could take down a lord, it was unlikely that anyone would dare to go up against him again. Rolls probably wouldn't attack since he was the most cautious of the three. As Lloyd felt his complete superiority, Jin decided to seize the moment and repeat the same trick as the Garth. This time, you can't just hit him because he'll be waiting to be hit. But the baby body has one small advantage that no one realizes. This body is extremely small and svelte. After dodging the Lloyd's attack, Jin decided to counterattack. The Duke's guard saw that Jin had accumulated mana around his fist. He froze in one place, which made it easy for our hero, and he hit Lloyd straight in the jaw with a right hook without any problems. Seeing how Jin handled Lloyd and Garth with two, Rolls said with surprise in his voice, "Who knew someone like you hit a power like that?" The first time might have been accidental, but the second time, I must say, the use of mana for a child's body was quite painful. Rolls is one who made it to Centurion by his wit, not his skill. But he's no better than Lloyd and Gort, but he's dangerous. Jin can't show him his weakness, but he couldn't attack him anymore either. Then our hero shouted, "Hey Snot, pass the message. Hearing this, Rolls was, and in real shock, but not because of Jean's insolence, but because of his ability to speak. From now on, anyone who mourns my mother, I include you, centurions, will not be left alive after meeting me, Jin added. It's funny how much the Rolls scared Jean considering that he, until a couple minutes ago, thought he was scum. His surprise, in a matter of seconds, turned to sheer terror. And like a little girl, he ran like a little girl away from Jin, begging for help. Monet's use of it drained Jean's childlike body far more than he could have imagined. A moment later, our hero's eyes went dark and he lost consciousness. Rumors of that quickly spread throughout the city. Even the Duke's palace was talking about it. After all, it's not every day an ordinary boy beats up centurions. But everyone was confused by the fact that Jin was more than 5 years younger than the young master of Babylon. He was considered to be the youngest warrior who could awaken the power. Anyway, it was just a rumor to people, but none of them saw it. Well, if everyone knew it was real, the Duke's children's hereditary position could change. The thing is, awakening mana is a great gift. Duke Agnes himself was only able to awaken it when he was 16, and the young master of Babylon could do it at 14. In this world, the order of succession is directly related to power. Therefore, as long as the rumors about Jin are not confirmed, the young master of Babylon, the first in line for the inheritance of Duke Agnes. Remember, I told you that rumors of what happened spread throughout the city, so they reached the Duke himself, which is why Jin came to the palace to talk to him. And in the meantime, Rolls arrived at Duke Ascura's to explain himself and give the details. The first thing the Duke asked the centurion was his name, and what unit he was serving in. Rolls, without hesitation, shouted out, "My lord, I am with the Steel in the 3rd Brigade in the 29th Battalion." Ascura looked at his aide with a heavy sigh and asked, "The 29th Battalion, isn't that the battalion of the Grismana Chiffon?" "Yes, my lord," the aide replied, upon learning the centurion's name and place of service. "The Duke has ordered the armor to be brought." It was the armor of a Gort, who Jin knocked out with a punch to the gut. Putting armor on the table, the Duke, with a fraction of doubt in his voice, said, "Duel. Are you saying that the person who did this is Jin?" Before Rolls gave his answer, the assistant intervened in the conversation and said, "Think carefully. If one word of what you said is a lie, you will not be forgiven." And yet, in a trembling voice, he answered, "Yes, my lord, not one word I said was a lie." Right after saying that, a heavy grimace appeared on the Duke's face. And then he said, "What do you think about it, Duciphone?" "Needless to say, it is hard to believe, my lord," replied the aide. "And really, it's hard enough to believe it's only 9 years old." After a few minutes of dreadful silence, the Duke said with a sullen look, "To think that he shattered an orc skin armor at such an age, with his bare hands. That's only possible with the help of mana." Ducifong shouted in horror when he heard this. "Duke Agnes, I'm sorry to be rude, but this is impossible." There was not a single instance in the history of the continent in which someone could use Manu in real combat at the age of 9. One would have to be at least a very talented rank B knight to cover their hands with mana. That was why, believing that 9-year-old Jin was able to do this was simply impossible. And then Ducifong shouted, "It was more like people were afraid that others would find out about his bullying, and then they made it all up." The Duke was convinced that Rolls had made it all up to avoid admitting his guilt. So he asked the Duke for permission to execute him in full view of everyone, to improve discipline in the army. As soon as the Chiffon grabbed his sword to punish Rolls for lying, the Duke said, "Enough. I don't think this guy's lying. I think there's something he's not telling me." And to get the whole truth, I invited Jean here. It was the first time in 9 years that Jean had received a formal invitation from the so-called Pope for an audience. Chiffon, it surprised him greatly, for the Duke had not shown such interest even in the young master Babylon, who was called the greatest genius of the empire. It might seem perfectly normal for a father to want to meet his son. But in this world, for a duke to meet a bastard is unthinkable. Meanwhile, in the first-floor hallway of Duke Agnes's mansion, this blonde-haired guy was the young master of Babylon everyone was talking about. He was also the son of a duke by a duchess. Like everyone else, he knew that his father had another son by another woman. So when he saw Jin and felt his aura, he knew at once who he was. But he didn't realize that the bastard had come for an audience with the Duke himself. And this is the current Emperor of Avalon, Marcus von Braten. When Jin sees this portrait, the anger inside begins to tear at him, because his heir and son, Caesar von Breton, was in a former life our hero's best friend, who betrayed him. And they look like 2 peas in a pod. as suddenly the young Babylon master shouted across the hallway, "How much longer are you going to ignore me?" Jin hadn't paid attention to him until that moment. Turning around, he saw his fist flying. And at this moment, Jin's vast combat experience from his past life came to bear. He was able to stop the Babylon master's fist, and he didn't even hesitate to use Manu. When their hands touched, the young Babylonian master felt a wild pressure and realized that all the rumors about the genie were true. And at that moment, out of the door came the Duke, who, seeing what was happening, shouted, "I'm tired of raising my voice today, so immediately stop." At the sight of the Duke, who was also his father, the young master immediately knelt down, as suddenly the Duke said angrily, "Son," I asked, "what are you doing now?" With complete obedience he replied, "Father, we were exchanging cordial greetings." Looking at Jin, the Duke said with a questioning tone, "Greetings meant?" Not wanting to aggravate the situation, Jin simply nodded his head. Sneezy was surprised that Jin dares to answer the Duke's question with a jaunty nod. And then he seized his sword and shouted, "Show your respect to Duke Agnes, and bow the knee!" When suddenly the Duke waved his hand and said, "Your look, it's filled with anger. Jin, you hate me." But it's all about the portrait. It reminds him of the face of an old friend, or rather a bastard and a traitor. There's a rage inside of him that's tearing him apart. He can't control his emotions. Also, Jin remembered very well that Agnes doesn't let people who show their hostility go so easily, and it makes absolutely no difference whether the hostile person is his child or not. When suddenly Agnes said, "If you've calmed down, come here please. I must see if you have used Manu or not." The young master of Babylon's jaw shook with anger at what he had heard. He could not believe that a stableman could use Manu. Duke Agnes, one of the 5 great masters of the empire. He's more sensitive to Mom than anyone. If he finds something abnormal, Jin's plan is over. Jin slowly and leisurely extended his hand to the Duke, and the latter grabbed his hand like crazy and started circulating mana. That's one way you can test a person for mana. The Duke poured some of his mana into Jin. If he didn't have mana, it would just disappear. But in Jin's case, when his mana sensed an outside mana, she concealed her presence. And then, Duke Agnes with a surprised face shouted out, "Nothing! Absolute zero!" "My lord, I told you it was just a silly rumor. Let me punish the liar who deceived," said the Duchiffon. But the Duke thought it very strange and suspicious. A person should have at least a little mana from the beginning. Even without a core, the simplest man has at least a modicum of mana. The genie, on the other hand, had none at all. Basically, the lack of mana in the eyes of Duke and Duchiffon, Jin is just made a walking dead man. Suddenly, Duchiffon said, "There may have been cases where someone was born without mana in the first place. I've heard of it from children, but I doubt it's even possible." But that's not all the oddities the Duke noticed in Gina. In addition to the complete lack of mana, where the mana core should be, there was some kind of sticky mass that emitted negative energy. The Duke found nothing criminal, but he did have a lot of questions about Jin. So from now on he's going to keep an eye on him, and to make it easier to do so, the Duke had ordered a room in the palace to be prepared for him. From now on, Jin will live under the Duke's careful watch. But not everyone was happy with the Duke's decision. And then Babylon cried out, "But father." Jin did not, before he could finish his sentence. The Duke interrupted him and said in an angry voice, "Babylon, is there a problem?" But that's not all. The Duke ordered the Chiffon to start training Jin in knighting. If he notices a progression in mana usage, the Chiffon is to teach Jin the techniques of the Crimson Knight. Chiffon never questioned Agnes's orders. But this time he thought the task at hand was impossible because Jin had no mana at all. But the Duke thought otherwise. He was certain that Jin harbored an incredible potential in the use of mana. Before he left, Duke said, "I look forward to our next meeting after your training, Jin." As the Duke had ordered, Siphon had assigned the genie one of the rooms in the mansion. In all the time Jin had spent in the mansion, he hadn't said a word. Chiffon was beginning to think that the rumors about Jin being deaf-mute were true. Jin's had a very busy day today. The only thing he wanted to do now was to lie down and sleep. Duke Agnes spends most of the year in the Golden Palace of Acadia, the capital of the Avalon Empire. The genie wondered if the Duke felt something he didn't even know he felt. It doesn't matter what he felt. It's dangerous if the Duke knows something he doesn't. However, it's the best time for me to think about it. The most important thing now is to regain my former strength. And to do this, I decided to practice not only with a chiffon, but also on my own. That night, Jin decided to test how well he could control his mana. Using that much mana is now much easier. The Jin can regain his former strength faster than he bargained for. Suddenly, Jin felt a sharp pain in his stomach. the negative energy in his mana core mixed together. After rebirth, the genie is a mixture of demonic and holy energies that fight and want to break free, and the force that holds them back is Rugia. Jin is still too weak to control the Rugia, but sooner or later he will subdue its power, and with it the demonic and holy energies. Meanwhile, at Jean's house, there was the following picture. Rolls, Gort, and Lloyd came to Lucia's house to beat her up. All because Jean destroyed their reputation. Lucia resisted with all her might. She even managed to bite Gort's arm and break free. But with that, she made him even angrier, and he couldn't help himself, and slapped her on the back of the head. Lucia's head hit the floor very hard. For a few seconds, she even lost consciousness. While she was unconscious, Lloyd went over and took her by the hair, and slapped her face to make her conscious. And when Lucia opened her eyes, Gort screamed, "Great! I want her to see me finish her off." But then Rolls intervened in the conversation and said, "Wait, Gort, don't do that. What if Jean finds out about it? I don't care if he finds out or not. Have you forgotten why we're here? We came to kill this bastard," replied the Gorth. But Rolls tried with all his might to dissuade his companions from that idea. But the thirst for revenge was too strong to just give up the idea, especially since they were under the legal protection of the Duchess. Rolls didn't want to be dishonorable for killing Lucia, so he left. But Gort and Lloyd decided to kill her, and now the blade is already rapidly approaching the girl's throat as suddenly from behind the door came a shout, "Enough!" When Gort and Lloyd saw him, they literally went crazy. Suddenly one of them shouted, "Why couldn't you have come a little later? I wanted to show you your mother's head." But then, Rolls said in a trembling voice, "Leave him alone. This kid is no longer the man we knew." Seeing his mother's mangled face, Jin said with pure rage in his voice, "Don't think you scumbags will get out of here alive." By this point, Lucia had no strength left at all. But when she heard her son's voice, she opened her eyes and whispered with all her might, "Son, run." Rolls was the only one who knew that Jin was under the Duke's surveillance, which is why he was trying to stop Gort and Lloyd. But those two didn't care at all. They just wanted revenge. As suddenly Jin sighed heavily and shouted, "Come out now!" Lloyd and Gort started laughing, thinking Jin was crazy. Once again, he can hardly handle 2 centurions at once. But Jin kept saying, "Come out. I can see you." But this time, Lyd wasn't laughing anymore. He didn't know what the hell Jin was talking about, when suddenly a man jumped down from the ceiling and said, "Funny. How did you know I was here?" "I was told you had no mana at all. How could you sense my presence then?" The stranger added, "I'd like you to meet, this is Knight Cain. Judging by the cross, he's one of the Crimson Knights." Jean's almost 100% sure it was the Chiffon who ordered him to follow him. The centurions immediately quieted their fervor and greeted Cain. Cain came closer and started to look at Jin closely. But he couldn't believe that this was the boy about whom so many rumors had been circulating. When all of a sudden Jin said, "I want to ask you something." And then the calm monotone voice changed to a loud and firm scream. The soldiers were trying to harm the lady of the Duke's house. And according to the military regulations of the House of Agnes, what happens in this situation? Jin asked the Cain. When suddenly Cain felt an incredibly overwhelming force, one that he simply couldn't resist, and then he felt his body begin to move on its own. Grabbing his sword by the hilt, he shouted, "According to the military regulations, this is punishable by immediate punishment." With the first swing of his blade, Cain punished Lloyd for what he'd done. Gort was next. But why would Cain suddenly decide to attack them? Could it be some ability of Jin's that we don't know about yet? Realizing death was imminent, Gorth begged to be spared, and swore it would never happen again. But Cain was unstoppable, and right after he took out the Gort, he pointed his blade at Rolls. And so when the blade came within centimeters of Rolls's neck, Jin said, "Stop, Cain, stop." Rolls was shaking with terror. With tears in his eyes and a trembling voice, he whispered, "Please, please spare me." Cain leaned over to him and whispered in his ear, "If you want to live even a second longer, you'd better be quiet." "Cain, I told you to stop," said Jin. "Master, I'm only punishing them for hurting the Duke's wife," replied Cain. "He is one of the 3 generations of knights known in the duchy. But he belongs to the purple knights who are considered the weakest. Also, he's probably one of the youngest if he couldn't resist the genie." After seeing him defeat the centurions with just a few sword swings, Jin was convinced that even among the C-rank knights, he was the strongest. When suddenly Jin said, "Let me ask you something before you do something. Who do you serve?" "Don't think for a second," Cain said. "Duke Agnes. Then one more thing. Who am I?" Pointing a finger at himself, Jin asked. And then Cain realized it all. This intense pressure and fierce stare. Jin was the Duke's son. For some unknown reason, Jin ordered Cain to hide the sword and let the Rolls go. After the pardon, Rolls fell to his knees and began to thank Jin for his mercy, and pledged his allegiance to him. I don't need the loyalty of someone like you. I will never let someone who dares to lay a hand on my mother live. Yet I am convinced that you are smart enough to realize that. I'll let you live. Only so you can tell the rest of the soldiers what happened without leaving out any details. If anyone dares to do something like that again, I will blow his head off with my own hands, said Jin. Disappear if what I just said got through to you, Jin added. Rolls was not a dragon, so immediately ran as far away as possible. When it was over, Cain looked at the genie once more and asked, Are you really the Count I know? The genie smiled and answered, You are very straightforward. Cain looked at Jin with increasing suspicion. But that wasn't surprising, since Jin had changed quite a bit in the last couple of days. Cain had seen him a few years ago, seeing the doubt in the knight's eyes. Jin said, An illegitimate son of a duke who can't speak. A stable boy who shovels poop and stagnates all day. When he heard that, all of Cain's doubts vanished in a second, and he shouted out, Count, I'm glad to greet you. All soldiers assigned to the Duchy of Agnes take orders directly from the Duke. However, knights are free to choose their own master to serve for the rest of their lives once they reach the age of 23. In a year's time, Cain, too, will face this choice. He may still be the hammer, but he realized that in this life you can only trust your instincts without question. So, for the next year, he will be looking after the genie. A good decision would be to choose the duchy's treasure, Babylon von Agnes, but not Jean, if you look into the future. When suddenly Jean saw his mom come to her senses. She was covered in bruises and scratches, but still beautiful. And even though she'd been beaten up, she was still thinking about her son. From that moment on, Jin made a promise to himself that he would protect his mom even at the cost of his own life. After all, she's the only one who loves him. Jin is grateful to the heavens for giving him a second chance to fix a past filled with regrets. His mother's tears motivated Jin even more to change his life for the better. For the whole world to know him as Gene Sanders, dubbed the strongest swordsman in history. Meanwhile, Count Asura was receiving guests. Specifically Count Rebreck, his old enemy in a friendly sense. This time he didn't arrive alone. Miss Iselin arrived with him. Despite the fact that the Earl of Rebreck has a lower status than a duke, he is someone who cannot be ignored for his influence in the empire. And his daughter, Iselin Rebecca, one of the most talented people. She and Babylon are closely watched. Magic that reached second grade at only 9 years old. There are some people who cannot use Manu because of the curse. But there are those who are able to use Manu better than anyone else because they have received the blessing. Iselin was just one of those who received this blessing. The mana blessing allows the user to sense and use mana without being trained to do so. It is also called the greatest gift of the gods among mages. The reason the Earl came with such a treasure is very simple. He wanted to give his daughter in marriage to Babylon, especially since Babylon would be 18 in 3 years. It could be said that this union would strengthen their family's position in the empire. It would seem that this union is beneficial to both families. But there was one small problem. Babylon was already engaged to Lady Charlie. Charlie is the daughter of the Font family, who earned their title of dukes for their wealth, not their strength. Agnes wouldn't mind Babylon marrying Iselin and Charlie at the same time. But unfortunately, that can't happen in this situation. Agnes's greed for talent is immeasurable as his greed for military might. One who judges others on their skills alone, despite name and family. That's what Duke Agnes is. That's why Dusifon admired him so much. When suddenly the Duke had a plan of sheer genius. He was overcome by his genius. Suddenly he said, "Why, how's Jean doing?" Such a question frightened the Chiffon, for he understood what the Duke was leading up to. Alarmed, the Chiffon said, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I'm not sure I understood you correctly." Agnes laughed and said, "You got it right. I'll give Jin the Iselin." In Chiffon's eyes, it seemed like a completely reckless act. After all, Iselin possessed the blessing of mana. Jin didn't even have it at all. They just don't know what Jin can do yet. His power is literally limitless. Meanwhile, our hero has arrived at the old ruins, where in his past life he recognized both Mene from nature. And he found Rugia. Behind the Duke's palace there is a small garden, to the north of which there is a large old rock. Before his return, Jean often climbed it to be closer to his late mother. Like once, near an old oak tree on this rock, he discovered a hidden passage. but the discovery of which must be paid for in blood. Luckily, it only takes a couple drops. Now this passage leads to the very ruins where the genie found the Rugia. Here, it was hidden very carefully, and the chance of finding it by accident is extremely low. Last time, Jin just fell out of a tree and broke his nose, and that time the blood opened a portal. But this time it looked different. When Jin first came here, this place wasn't so badly destroyed, and the Rugia was on the altar in the center of the temple, all in chains. But this time, an altar, no Rugia or chains, and the temple looked more abandoned. However, the altar was not empty. Where Jin had found the spear last time, there was some kind of metal rod. When Jin touched it, he felt the metal begin to heat up. A bright light began to emit from the metal as he touched it. Soon the light became so bright that it became impossible to keep my eyes open. But after a moment, it was over. It was scary, and for a moment Jin thought he was dying. But when Jin opened his eyes and looked around, he was horrified to see that there was nothing around. Everything was so white. What if he had really died? And this was the afterlife. When all of a sudden someone yelled, "Hey kid, come here!" But turning around, Jin saw that the very same metal rod he had picked up was talking to him. As suddenly, this rod with indignation in his voice said, actually offended, "I'm not a metal rod doofus. I am an artifact of the demon god Rugia." Hearing this, the genie shouted out in surprise, "What the hell? You can read my mind too?" The spear Jin fought with was an artifact of the demon god. But why does it look different? Perhaps its appearance changed because it traveled back in time with the genie. When suddenly Rugia spoke again, "We have no such thing as time," is that the two energies in your body will eventually kill you. And there's only one way to harness them. Get your power back as fast as you can. In your condition, you will have to reach the 4th stage of spear magic. The ancient spear technique that Jin had studied was spear magic. This technique, combined with his boundless mana, gave him unprecedented power. All knights of the continent and Grant used only swords and nothing else. Spears, on the other hand, were considered weak and useless toys. However, before his return, only a few people in the entire world could defeat him. Back then, he was at the 5th stage. Speaking of ranks, A-ranked knights could create swords with mana. Masters were the strongest in absolute ranks. Although the magic spear mastery was divided into 8 stages, even at the 5th stage, Jin was already considered the greatest knight of the empire. So if Jin reaches the 4th stage, he will not be inferior to the strongest B-ranked knights in terms of strength. It shouldn't be too difficult, given the knowledge and skills Jin already possesses. The only problem is time. It's too little. And in this state, it would be difficult to train mana control. As suddenly, Rugia laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. As long as I'm around, you can use Manu to some extent without repercussions. Keep practicing and improving your skills. When you reach the peak and I can get my strength back. And together we can make your dream come true." As soon as Rugia stopped talking, the light she was emitting began to gradually intensify, just as it had last time. And that's it. Jin and Rugia are back together. I think it's worth explaining that Jin just visited the consciousness of his spear. A mana cultivation technique that no one else in the entire continent can master. The ability to absorb at least a handful of mana from the surroundings. This is the 1st stage of magical spear handling. When, next to the Rugia, the genie had only the thought of accumulating mana, as he had it all worked out. The 1st stage of magical spear handling, first style. You need to concentrate as much mana as possible in one spot, and then aim it forward to hit the target with an explosion. Boom! This is the first time since the rebirth that our hero feels his power again. With this blow, you could easily destroy a thick wall of a fortress or tear down a house. I could feel the power flowing through my veins, Jean shouted. And that's just the beginning, Caesar von Brighton. Back to the real world. This is the reception room of the Duchy of Agnes. The guests were waiting for the Duke's audience when suddenly the waiter said, "Distinguished guests, please welcome Duke Agnes and his protégé du chiffon." But there were more guests than Agnes thought. First, Duke Agnes was greeted by Cheryl de Font, daughter of Demoa Font. When he saw her, Agnes said, "Cheryl, what brings you here so late?" Before the girl could answer, her assistant Cox de Font intervened and said, "I apologize, Lord, but Mrs. Cheryl insisted on coming here." Cox is a prominent vassal of the House of Font. All of his house's funds are audited by him personally. Despite his outward appearance, a very kind and pleasant man. When suddenly Cheryl shouted, "My lord, even though we haven't seen each other for a long time, you go too far. When you try to steal something of treasure?" Laughing, Agnes replied, "Now I'll find out. Your respectful greeting made me wonder if it was really you. Cox apologized relentlessly for Cheryl's behavior, deeming it inappropriate. But he couldn't change it. At the end of the banquet hall, Agnes notices more guests and says, "My God, I'm sorry, Fonsel. I forgot all about you." Iselin greeted the Duke properly, with all manners of manners. Unlike Cheryl, Iselin was very calm and reserved. For her, subordination wasn't just a word. Cheryl was not happy to see Iselin here. After all, she knew why she had come here, when suddenly the girl shouted across the hall, "Oh right, I heard that the Duke's illegitimate son beat up 3 centurions." Cox turned pale at this arrogance, and then he couldn't take it anymore and he screamed, "Cheryl, please stop!" But the girl didn't see anything wrong with it. She just wanted to know if the rumors were true, and that's when the chiffon stepped in. "That's right, Lady Cheryl, it's just a rumor. Young Master Jin has the curse of mana. How could such a man beat 3 centurions?" Upon hearing this, Count Fonsel cried out in surprise. "Is this true? The second Earl has the curse of mana?" Things are clearly not going according to Agnes's plan. With doubt in his voice, the Duke said, "Now is the perfect time. Don't you want to see it?" The thing is, Count Fonsel is one of the few mages of this level in the entire Empire, and he's clearly more susceptible to magic than we knight like Agnes. It is for this reason that the Duke wants Fonsel to look at him. In turn, a good opportunity for the Earl to improve his position in the Duke's eyes, so he agreed. Chiffon had another idea how you can know for sure if a genie has curse of mana or not. Chippon has proposed a duel, Jin against the best warrior from his garrison. Agnes questioned the appropriateness of this battle. A knight of the martial order versus a 9-year-old. Seeing the doubt in the Lord's eyes, Chiffon said, "Lord, I understand how it looks, but if the rumors are true, then someone of this level is needed. I happen to have the right man, and if you give the order, I promise what you see will not disappoint." The next day, the very soldier he wanted to put Jin against arrived at the Chiffang's office, and he's just arrived to give a report from last night's events. After reading it very carefully and several times, the Chiffon sighed heavily and said, "According to the military regulations, you may subject them to immediate punishment. But do you not think it was hasty?" Without a shred of doubt, Kane said, "No way. They wanted to harm the lady of the Duke's house." Upon hearing this, the Chiffon became furious, and he shouted, "Is what you just said true? They dared to do such a thing to Lady Vanessa?" "Negative, Commander. Not with Lady Vanessa, but with Lady Lucia," replied Kane. Upon hearing this, the Chiffon breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Lady Lucy?" "Lucia, you mean?" "That's right, the Duke's second wife," Kane replied. Technically, Kane overstepped his authority and took 2 centurions out of action over a concubine. But still, Kane was sure of the rightness of his actions. And then he said, "Lady Lucia is the honorable lady of the Duke's house. She is not someone whom ordinary soldiers can harm. Their actions were both an insult and a challenge to the Duke. If I have done something wrong, you are prepared to be punished for it," Kane added. It's a very, very specific situation. Technically, Kane is wrong, but had he done otherwise, the consequences could have been much worse. After thinking it over, the Chiffon said, "Okay, let's consider this case closed. You have a new assignment. Tonight you're gonna have an easy one with young Master Jin, but be careful. I suspect I'm as easy as I look." Kane couldn't believe his ears. He had absolutely no desire to spar with the genie, especially after meeting him. But he couldn't disobey an order from the Duke himself. The Chiffon said, "This guy is needed to make sure that the genie has the curse of mana on him. The Duke still can't believe it, and it will be a hindrance for the young Master of Babylon." Kane didn't quite understand what the commander meant, so he asked, "Do you really think that the young Master of Babylon will be deposed?" Pounding his fist on the table, the Chiffon shouted, "Don't talk nonsense! Master Babylon is a genius like no other in the world. Do you think he'll stoop to some pebble you can kick for nothing?" Chiffon added. The guy Kane saw with his own eyes wasn't a pebble. He was a meteor cutting through the vast sky to destroy everything on Earth. In other words, Chiffon wants Kane to inject a small amount of mana into the genie during sparring, but only so no one will notice. And if the genie really has the mana curse, his body will reject it. The thing is, when magic enters the body of someone with a mana curse, it affects them like me, so they die within a few days. It was no secret that the Chiffon was on the side of the young Master of Babylon, but the Edge of Naught expected him to show his true colors like this. Now Kane is faced with a hard choice: to follow orders or not. Kane was not just a warrior who blindly followed orders, he was also a man of honor. So he decided not to follow orders, especially since he had promised Jin to keep an eye on him. When suddenly our hero walks into the sparring room and says, "Oh, Kane, hi. I hear you and I are having a boy. I think it'll be interesting to see." With a sad look, the Kine replied, "Yes, to test your abilities. The Duke plans to attend the sparring in person." For the genie, it was the perfect moment to demonstrate his powers. Now that Rugia was with him, I could tell by the Kine that he was very nervous. He was shifting his training swords from side to side when he suddenly said, "Sir, don't worry, I'm not going to fight you at full strength." Hearing this, Jin laughed and said, "Kane, don't be ridiculous. You were going to test me. The right to choose your own lord is an exclusive power given only to you knights. But on the other hand, I have the right to choose my subordinates. I don't plan on entrusting my life to someone so insignificant and weak. If you want to see the real me, you'll have to try. That's what your sword is for," Jin added. As suddenly, Asura, Chiffon, and even many distinguished guests entered the training room. At the sight of the Duke, Kine instantly bowed, showing his respect. But Jin just kept standing there. Looking at him, Chiffon thought Jin was a real idiot. He couldn't even bend his knee. But then, Jin got down on one knee, bowed his head, and said, "I am Jean von Agnes, greetings, Duke." To say that the Duke and Chiffon were surprised by this is not to say anything. Smiling, Agnes said, "I don't remember teaching you etiquette, but you're doing well." "I'm learning by watching, father," replied Jin. "Jean, you've already heard about what's going on, haven't you?" "Yes, I was told you'd like to test me." And again, young Master Jin Chiffon enters their conversation. "There's been a misunderstanding. This is not Herzen's trial, but his attention to you. He wants to better study your ailment in order to cure it." To the genie, those words seemed amusing. After all, he knew the truth. He knew the Chiffon was a bastard who wanted to kill him. Suddenly the Duke shouted, "Are you ready?" Coming closer, he replied, "Yes, just give the order." That would have been all right, but the Duke had a plan of his own. He had no doubts about the Kane's power. But he's appointed Babylon as the genie's opponent tonight. After all, the outcome of their battle will determine who will be the next Duke. Since it was a practice fight, the Duke ordered them to use wooden swords. Taking the sword in his hand and pointing it at Jin, Babylon said, "Brother, don't worry. I won't beat you up too badly. I'll fight at half strength." Babylon and Chiffon want to put on a colorful show to kill Jin. But to be honest, Jin wasn't averse to an exciting fight himself, but only with a very different outcome. Instead of a ball, Jin took an ordinary mop and broke it to make a kind of spear. This intrigued the Duke, and not only him, everyone around him found it quite interesting. Holding the broken mop forward, Jin said, "Hey Babylon, see this? That's enough to kick your ass." When Cheryl saw this, she laughed all the way across the training room. She found the act quite amusing. But the Chiffon, he didn't see anything exciting about it. And then he said, "What are you going to do with that stick? Don't be silly." But the Duke stopped him. He asked Jin in all seriousness if he was sure of his choice. Without the slightest doubt in his eyes, Jin answered quickly and clearly, "Yes, father." "Well, I think we're in for a very interesting fight." The only restriction the Duke made is that Babylon must not use mana. To be honest, she wasn't going to do it. After all, he thought wasting mana on Jin was useless. Watching from the sidelines, Kane couldn't figure out what he was thinking when he did it. Before the battle began, Babylon looked the genie straight in the eye and said, "I wonder," pulled toward the familiar. "This rod fits you perfectly." But Jin just ignored it. He knows Babylon too well to fall for such a thing. And then the Duke started their fight. Well, let's see which of the two brothers is stronger. Babylon, feeling his absolute superiority, chose rather aggressive tactics. Strong and powerful blows, straight to the forehead. But Jin expected this. And when Babylon came close enough, Jin extended his spear to meet his little brother. Because of this, Babylon had to dodge rather than attack. When suddenly he said, "Hey Jin, I think you know a trick or two, but trust me, it won't help you." Everyone around me was saying that Babylon had reached the level of a C-rank knight at 15. But other than speed, Jin didn't notice anything else special, neither strength nor intelligence. Although his movements are very fast, they are very easy to predict. With only one false attack, Jin was able to deceive him, followed by a successful counterattack. The fact that the Jin was able to touch him made Babylon mad. As suddenly he shouted, "You're just a bastard who can't even be a soldier! How dare you!" Before the poor guy could speak, Jin's spear slammed right into his stomach. But along with high speed, Babylon also acquired good reflexes. so he was able to stop Jin's spear before it hit him. Now, the perfect chance to prove yourself. But it's too dangerous to use mana at this distance. While Jin was pondering his next action, Babylon decided to attack him using mana. That's why he's compared to a C-class knight. Because of his high level of mana usage, seeing that Babylon was no longer holding back, the Duke shouted, "Babylon, that's enough!" But it was too late. Babylon had no time to stop, and there was a huge explosion. But when the dust cloud settled, everyone around them saw an amazing sight. It wasn't really an explosion, but a massive amount of mana. Jin saturated his weapon with mana, making it a magical spear. So when Babylon tried to strike Jin, the sword shattered into pieces. Seeing this, Count Foncel shouted out, "My God, there is no doubt it is mana." Babylon, as well as the others, could not believe that Start could awaken magical power at such a young age. Sensing defeat inevitably approaching, Babylon grabbed the real sword and shouted, "It doesn't matter! I will be the heir to the duchy!" Gina wasn't interested in the throne because he knew it was the Duchy of Disappear 10 years later during the Civil War. But on the other hand, if there is a place of support, it will be much easier for him to realize his plan. So, Jean decided that he must become the Duke's heir no matter what it takes. All this time, Asura watched the anime with great interest. But when things went too far, he ordered them to stop. When the brothers stopped the battle, the Duke said with a dead stare, "You will both be punished to the full extent of the law if you continue the battle." Well, their battle is over for now, especially since it had already served its purpose. Jin has manifested his mana. What Shifan was not a fan of Babylon. He recognized that mana awakening at 9 years old was a miracle, because it was the first time such a thing had happened. From this point on, the future position of Shifan and Babylon is in a very precarious state. As suddenly Shifan said, "My lord, was it mana?" But Count Fonsel comes in and says, "Duke, from what I saw, I'm 100% sure it was mana. It's not as much as the Earl of Babylon, but it's unlike any other we know, especially when you consider its concentration." I have to admit, Jean managed to surprise everyone here. Think about it. Everyone thought he had the curse of mana, and he was able to awaken it at the age of 9, a fact that surprised the Duke as much as anyone. And again, Chifan bursts into the conversation and says, "But Duke, it's mana." "Shut your mouth! You're a little too active today. Don't forget who you're talking to," Asura replied with incredible anger in his voice. After that, Chapon had no choice but to apologize. The practice fight was over. Duke had a few more things he had to do, so he set up an appointment for Jin to meet him tonight in an informal setting. When Chifon and Babylon heard this, they almost fainted. So great was their surprise, because even Babylon, the Duke's direct heir, had not seen his father informally. He was determined to find out how Jin had gained such power. Jin, without the slightest doubt looking straight into the Duke's eyes, replied, "Understood. Then I'll see you tonight." Right after the formal banquet, Coke and Cheryl were to go home. But the young countess changed her mind. What she saw today struck her so strongly that she decided to stay. She asked Cox a long time about Gina, and then in the middle of it she said, "I was worried about him being a bastard, but I've made up my mind. He will be mine." But before dinner, there was something very interesting. Siphon was the right hand of Duke Agnes, but he was also an ardent admirer of Babylon, therefore, that Babylon had lost to the genie. He reported in Vanessa Agnes, wife of Duke Agnes. Every time, Vanessa would ask if Jean had won, and when the chiffon would say yes, the Duchess would punch him in the face, hoping it was a lie. She just couldn't believe that Jin could awaken Manu and be stronger than her firstborn. But that was not the end of the bad news for her. Chippen also told the Duchess that Agnes was going to take the genie to the capital of the Empire. From the moment Duke saw Jean's talent, he wants to keep him close to him to observe him. Suddenly, Chiffon said, "We'll be in a quandary if this happens anyway." The Duchess gracefully flicked her hair off her shoulders and replied, "You wouldn't have happened if you had done as I said." But the chiffon would not have come with this news to the Duchess without a new plan, for he knew Agnes well enough. He dared to assume that in the capital he would tell the whole empire that his son was a C-rank mana user. Well, to do this, Jin will have to pass an exam to wear the rank of C-rank knight, and the exam will be with a real royal knight who knows no mercy. On hearing this, the Duchess realized everything. Suddenly she screamed out, "Oh my God, this is perfect! I have to get in touch with my uncle right away!" And now, let's get to the main event of the day, of Jin and Asura meeting for the first time, one-on-one with no one else around. Upon entering the room, Jin greeted the Duke, bending his knee. As suddenly the Duke looked at him in all seriousness and said, "Someone? What's your name?" "I, Jin von Agnes." Without the slightest hesitation, Jin replied. Looking at Jean, Duke noticed how much he had changed. Jean had changed since the last time they met. But that's not surprising, since it's been over 3 years. In a moment of awkward silence, the Duke sighed heavily and asked, "Tell me, do you hate me?" "I don't hate you. I pissed on the palace and hid my powers so you couldn't expect much from me. However, I have one request," replied the genie. "It's about the trip to Acadia," the guy added. Not finishing Jin's request, Agnes smiled and said, "Are you so sure I'll take you to the capital? Jin may look like a child, but don't forget that he's actually an experienced warrior and a pretty good politician." So he knew there were 2 reasons why Asura would take him to the capital. First of all, up until now, the Duke had one heir, but then Jin showed up, so the Duke has to get him out of here to avoid trouble. And the second reason is Asker's own unwillingness to let him go, as suddenly he said, "If I can become strong enough to surpass even you, then the Duchy of Agnes can be reborn again." In spite of his insolence, the Duke liked his ambition. And then he said, "Listening to you, it seems as if you have the strength to do it." "At the very least, I won't disappoint you, sir," Jin replied. The Duke thought Jean was a real natural, and even adults can't be so sure when standing in front of him. Jin, thought Agnes, taking him with him to the capital to send him to Acadia Academy. All children of noble blood must attend the academy for 6 years, from the age of 10 to 15. There is also the possibility of graduating earlier for those with the same abilities, yes, and that he led. This academy was created by the royal family to ensure that the children of aristocrats maintain the loyalty of the royal family and recruit outstanding talent. That's why Agnes didn't want Jin to study there either. He wanted to teach him on his own. Is a great opportunity to learn the art of the sword from one of the 5 masters of the Empire. All knights can only dream of such a thing. There was one small problem, however. Agnes was a master swordsman, and Jin has already chosen his primary weapon. He wants to defeat his enemies with a spear in his hand. The Duke was very surprised to hear that. After all, in the history of mankind, there had never been a great warrior who had wielded a spear. Releasing some of his mana, the Duke asked, "I don't understand. Do you really want to use the spear?" "Sometimes you forget how powerful Agnes is. He's only released a fraction of his mana. But even so, it's incredibly hard to stay on your feet. However, as much as Agnes is proud of his sword, as much as Jin is proud of his spear, therefore, even under the influence of mana, he did not change his mind and replied, "I will destroy the love who gets in my way with my spear. Even if that someone is one of the 9 stars like you, my lord." Within seconds, the Duke's face turned sullen, and he shouted, "Destroy 9 Starborn. That's funny. Show me what your spear is worth." Of course, in an even fight and at full strength now, there's no way a genie can stand up to Agnes. But it's a good chance to do something. Before beginning, Agnes laid down conditions. If Jin passed his test, he would be able to use the spear, and he would listen to his request. However, if he failed the test, he would have to obey all instructions. It was clear that the Duke would force Jin to learn swordsmanship. But our hero was firmly convinced that this will not happen, because he is not going to hide his abilities. I'm sorry, but the battle wasn't shown. But still, I can say that Jin passed the test. After the battle with him, Jin was only once again convinced of how strong and amazing he was. He was shaking with adrenaline. As soon as Jin left the training room, Babylon came around the corner, and he said, "Jin, we need to talk." But Jin, on the other hand, thought otherwise. He didn't want to talk to him. So he just turned around and walked away. And then Babylon cried out, "Let's fight again, right now!" Turning around, Jin saw that his gaze was different this time. Now, this is the Babylon he knew. He was always hungry for victory, and that's what ultimately destroyed him. And meanwhile, in the capital, in the Imperial castle, the Palace of Kalke, meet Emperor Marcus von Britain, father of the Briton who betrayed our Jin. And now he has learned that Duke Agnes had another talented son. The thing is, Duchess Vanessa was his older sister, so he was not immediately told that the new genius was a bastard. It would seem that this news should have saddened him. But he didn't care at all, for he himself had had many illegitimate children. The only thing that upset him was that Duke Agnes already had 2 geniuses in his family. Actually, he was jealous, when suddenly his subordinate shouted out, "Your Highness, no one doubts Babylon's strength, but the princes are also talented. One day they will shake the world." No, I'm sure some can become emperor, but they are weak in terms of combat power. The emperor doesn't think much of his children, but they're also very talented. This is because the emperor himself is so strong that he is a master. Therefore, his standards are extremely high. Maybe that's why his desire for talent is so excessive. as suddenly, Emperor Marcus said, "If Duke Agnes is no longer gathering from this child's bed, it means that he is at least as strong as Babylon." Heard this, his subordinates and in a trembling voice said, "Your Highness, there is a rumor that Babylon has lost to him." Hearing this, the emperor jumped up alarmed and asked, "Lost? Is this boy really older than Babylon?" "No, your Highness, Duke Agnes's bastard is only 9 years old," replied the servant. "If these rumors are true, then Duke Agnes's bastard is already as strong as a C-rank knight, and this, at 9 years of age. It gets curiouser and curiouser," Emperor Marcus added. The servant even began to worry that the emperor would personally want to test Manu Jin. The emperor's power is literally limitless. He can do whatever he wants. But unfortunately for the emperor himself, he won't be able to attend the trials in person, because of the wave of protests he must deal with. However, he will send his best son to keep an eye on the genie and report back. Meanwhile, Jin and Babylon were already fighting at full strength. To an ordinary person, this would be impossible, because Jin just fought a sword master and spent a lot of mana, which takes a long time to replenish. But that's no problem at all for Jin. He uses nature's mana. Even now, the difference in mana-wielding skills could be seen by the naked eye. Seeing the despair in Babylon's eyes, Jin said, "It's written all over your face. I'll help you realize how scary the martial arts you look down on can be." Without listening to Jin, Babylon pointed his sword at his brother's neck and shouted, "Don't you dare underestimate me." Jin did it all on purpose to provoke Babylon to strike. Concentrating a huge amount of mana in his right fist, Jin shouted, "Aura Blast!" This is a technique that releases a huge amount of mana in a split second, causing an explosion. This is one of Jin's favorite moves from his past life. Only a few C-rank knights can do this. Lying on the floor, twisted in pain, Babylon finally recognized that Jin was much stronger than he was. As the dust cloud settled, Babylon saw Jin standing over him. Suddenly our hero said, "Scared? So become stronger, and never forget what you felt now, when you fell at the hands of someone you thought was garbage. Believe me, brother, if I could do what I wanted, I would have torn you apart back then, who insulted my mother and me to pieces. But for the first time, I saw in your eyes a desire for power, so I will let you go. But if you don't change your attitude, I'll make sure you can never hold a sword with this hand. And remember the difference between us right now," Jin added, for the first time since his birth. When Babylon felt humiliated, it was a feeling he had never experienced before. The next morning, in the Duchy of Agnes, ever since the Jin absorbed the personality of the Rugia, controlling mana has become much easier. However, such a long and uninterrupted use of mana would severely deplete his body. It was already clear that although Jin's mana was unlimited, it was still limited by the physical capabilities of a 9-year-old body. When suddenly, someone knocked on his door. Jin thought it was Cain, for he would accompany him on his journey to the capital. But when he opened the door, our hero saw the beautiful Shirley standing in front of him. The first thing the girl did was introduce herself, and said that she was only a year younger than Jin, so they were free to socialize, when suddenly she came into the room and said, "Jin, if you want, you can call me Big Sister. Close the door, I think we have something to talk about." But no sooner had the girl entered the room than Jin blocked her way with his hand. Leaning into her ear, Jin whispered, "Hey Cheryl, I know you a lot better than you can imagine, so back off." After which, Jin just pushed her out of the room and slammed the door right in her face. The young mistress's face showed real surprise. No one had ever treated her like this before, but half a minute later, there was another knock on his door. Jin that before, and now didn't like people who didn't understand the first time, so he got very angry. So when he opened the door, the genie shouted, "Didn't I tell you to back off?" But hearing silence in reply, the genie opened his eyes and saw Cain standing in front of him with a frightened face. Confused, the young knight said, "Oh, Kravchan, I apologize. If you are busy, I will come back later." This whole situation made Jin laugh a lot, so he invited Cain to come inside. Aside from the fact that Cain would accompany the young earl on the trip, Jin had also assigned him a case. Closing the door, Cain said, "I've accomplished everything, but I don't understand why you would do this." But in response, Jin just smiled and said, "Don't worry, just trust and listen to me, and in time you will understand." Meanwhile, someone called all the centurions to the training room. After Lloyd and Gort were beaten by the Jin, the rest of the centurions began to bully the Rolls. After that, Rolls stopped talking to anyone. Some people even began to joke that he had passed on Jin's affliction, when suddenly from the shadows came a voice. "Attention, everyone. A second later, Kane and Jin stepped into the light. When the centurions saw them, they all shouted, "Hail Sir Knight Kane of the Crimson Order!" And looking at Jean, everyone was whispering among themselves, except Rolls. He was truly terrified at the sight of Jean, when suddenly Kane said, "Centurion, this man will do the training today." Jean said in a calm and confident voice, "Centurion, I will be in charge of your training today. My name is Jean von Agnes." To say they were surprised is not to say they were shocked. The whole point is that centurions will be fighting in the vanguard during the war. Therefore, their individual skills are most important, and Jin came here today to evaluate their skills. He ordered everyone to come to him. When the centurions heard Jin's orders, they laughed like little children. They thought the young count was just trying to play war games with them. To be honest, even Kane doubted the idea. After all, centurions are strong warriors, no matter how you look at it. When all of a sudden, some two idiots got it in their heads to yell, "You're gonna be okay. You're going to get hurt badly." Exactly! Even if craft, it's an insult to us. After listening to the centurion's displeasure, Jin silently picked up his spear and approached them. By pulling the hounds apart and pointing the tip of your spear at the Rolls, Jin said, "You, do you think so too?" From fear, tears began to appear on Roll's face. Just as suddenly he cried out, "No, I would never think that, Mr. Jin." And then Jan shouted at the whole training hall, "Shut your mouth! Why, you didn't keep your word and didn't say what you had to do." Falling on his knees and bowing his head to the floor, Rolls begged pardon for the rudeness of his comrades in arms, and asked pardon for everyone, including himself. Jin stuck his spear a few centimeters from Roll's head, turned to everyone and said, "He will not be forgiven twice, nor will any of you. After you tried to hurt my mother, I could have killed you, but I gave you a chance. But you threw that chance away. So you're gonna do the same thing to Lloyd and Gort." And now the rest of the centurions realize that those two are gone, because Jin mutilated them. Rolls, I tried my best to ask for another chance, but Jin was defiant. However, since Rolls was a centurion of the Duchy of Agnes, he let him keep his honor. And then Jin said, "Take out your sword. If you can defeat me, I will pretend that nothing happened." Well, he knew he was going to die anyway, so he decided to give it his best, especially since his opponent is still a kid, for all intents and purposes. For a second, Du even thought he had a chance to win. We've had since the last time they met, Jin has changed a lot. After all, he had absorbed the Rugia, so it wasn't too difficult to fend off such a primitive attack from such a weak opponent. But this time, Jin even went a little overboard. With a single blow, he threw Rolls to the other end of the hall, even though he was dodging his blow, not attacking it. But at least now, all the centurions know what the young count is capable of. And they'll finally get away from his mother. As suddenly, Jean shouted, "Judging your opponent based on his appearance will drive you straight to your grave on the battlefield. If you still have any doubts about my abilities, come and check them again," Jin added. All the centurions stood still without moving, but one still had the courage to approach Jin. "But trust me, it's not what you think." He stepped forward to greet Count Jin. Dropping to one knee, the centurion said, "The 23rd centurion leader greets you, Count Jin," followed by the rest of the centurion leaders who bent the knee and saluted our hero. In case you haven't figured it out, the request that Jin asked Kane to make was to conduct a training session with the centurions. After that, Kane firmly decided for himself that he would choose Jin as his lord next year. Meanwhile, Cheryl was in her room feeling very sad about what had happened, when suddenly Cox comes running into her room and excitedly shouts, "Mistress Cheryl, I have news for you. Soon an order of Imperial knights will arrive in the duchy." But the girl didn't care at all. She fell like a stone from a rock onto the pillow and whispered, "I told you not to bother me." The news that the young Count Jin had executed a centurion quickly reached the Duke. In his defense, Jin said, "You know what he did." So I, in accordance with military regulations, immediately executed the one who insulted the noble blood. To himself, the Duke thought, "If I had been there, you would have cut them in half with your blade." However, he said something completely different. "Jin, it was too hasty a decision." Seeing the doubt in the Duke's eyes, Jin rose from his knees and said, "Do you think these were the actions of a little boy who has no control over himself? Just a couple days ago, I was the son of a concubine who was thrown into a stable. That's why it's hard for me to gain their respect, even though I've gained power. Overwhelming force, that's what they understand. I wanted to instill fear in them, so they wouldn't speak ill of me or my mother. Also, to show that I also had Duke's blood in me, I had to show it to all the centurions," Jin added. I couldn't think of a better answer. Even though technically the Duke should have punished Jin, but he didn't. because he still loved Lucia. Meet the first leader of the Order of the Armstrong Golden Mane, one of the loyal warriors of the Agnes titles. Armstrong was insanely happy that their duchy had 2 C-rank knights with minors. Well, Chiffon thought otherwise. He thought Jin was just a regular bastard. But all of this is only because with the advent of the genie, his situation worsened, when suddenly the Duke and Jin came out to them. After looking at them, the Duke said, "The Knights of the Imperial Order will arrive soon, and you are fighting as you would a servant." Chiffon and Armstrong greeted their Duke. Was the first time Armstrong and Jean had ever met in person. Seeing our hero, the knight thought the rumors about him were exaggerated. I mean, he didn't look strong. When suddenly, at the entrance to the town, there was a loud clatter of horseshoes against the ground. And that could only mean one thing, that the Knights of the Imperial Order had already arrived. When he saw the warriors, the Chiffon asked in surprise, "Has he come to us too? That the Imperial Palace has sent a whole battalion?" After a moment, the carriage door opened, and the first thing our heroes saw was a small foot more like a woman's. But no, it was one of the great Emperor's sons. When Duke Agnes saw the young prince, he shouted, "Greetings, 4th Prince of the Empire!" The 4th Principal, Caesar von Britten. Jean couldn't believe this moment had come so quickly. Remember this face? This is Captain Joker of the 1st Army of Imperial Knights, call sign Joker. He's the one who's been assigned to test Jin. And believe me, he will fight to the best of his ability. Even though Jin is still a child, Joker was one of the prince's traveling companions on a trip to the Duchy of Agnes. Well, in addition to his main assignment, he's also been given a task by Duchess Vanessa. He has to make sure Jin can never pick up a sword again in his life. Upon seeing Jin, Caesar said, "So you are the rumored count." But looking at him, all Jin could see was rage. He looked at him and imagined ripping his head off. Seeing that Jin ignored the principal's question, one of his aides stepped forward and said, "Count Jin, show your respect, you are standing in front of the prince." Pulling a smile from ear to ear, Jin mockingly replied, "There are no 2 sons in the empire. Except for the lord we serve. There is only one emperor who deserves the respect of all the knights of the Avalon Empire. Is there any reason why I should show respect to the 4th principal, that the origin is not even pure?" Jin added. When he heard this, a man in the crowd shouted, "Knights forward! You must be out of your mind." That man was Deputy Captain Valmont of the 9th Order of Imperial Knights. Seeing a troop of warriors coming at the young earl, Armstrong bared his sword and stood in front of the genie. Because whatever it was, Jean belonged to the Duchy of Agus. And Armstrong had sworn an oath to protect that duchy with his life. When suddenly Duke Agnes himself intervened in the conversation. Activating the mana suppression, he said, "Both of you. Now you're in front of the prince. Have you had enough of living?" Before, Valmont had heard much about Duke Agnes, but had never seen his power in person. And after experiencing it for himself, he realized why Agnes was one of the 9 known empires. When the knights had calmed down, the Duke cast an icy stare at Jin and said, "All of this happened because of you. Apologize to the prince. But Caesar now, he's not the Caesar we know. He's still a kind and humorous kid." He didn't find Jean's words offensive. On the contrary, even praise, especially since his words were true. Moving closer to the genie, Caesar shouted, "Isn't young Craft Genie right that the only one who deserves the respect of all the knights of the empire is His Majesty the Emperor?" When suddenly, his voice became calmer. And then he said in a half-whisper, "I'm sure Jin is aware that you have to take responsibility for everything." Watching everything going on, Jean recognized the same Caesar who always tried to solve everything with words. But Jin wasn't going to kill the prince now. He wanted to wait until he had everything before slitting his throat. When suddenly, the Joker comes up to the genie and screams right in his face, threatening to punish him for such insolence. Bowing his head to the prince, Joker asked the prince for permission to personally test Jin's abilities. Without a second thought, Caesar approved Joker's request, and he informed everyone around him of his decision. It was all part of the Joker's plan. After all, that's how he could fulfill Duchess Vanessa's orders. From words, they decided to get straight to the point, so they headed for the duchy's training hall. Seeing that Jin would not be fighting with a sword, Joker said in surprise, "An iron stick? Are you kidding me? You think we're playing games here? Don't think it's going to be that easy. You think it's easy because people praise you for your talent. And you've become so arrogant that you even insulted the Prince of the Imperial Knights," added Caesar. Without hearing him finish, Jin started laughing and said, "I bet the Imperial Knights are chosen for their talent," says Joker, amused at Jin's sass. After all, he'd once been like that himself. However, Jin wasn't going to listen to the Imperial Knight's ramblings for long. He was already eager to show his full strength to Caesar. It would be presumptuous to expect a warrior like the Joker to fall for such a simple attack. But Jin didn't want to end the fight with one punch. He just wanted Joker to feel his mana, so strong and unbridled. Despite its many advantages, the spear has one very serious disadvantage. It is uncomfortable in short-range combat. For some reason, all of Jin's enemies think that shortening the distance gives him an advantage. But Jin was able to minimize this disadvantage of the spear with hard training. Thanks to his skill and the length of his spear, Jin can keep the enemy from getting too close to him for a long time, and keep him at a distance, forcing him to defend himself. But beyond that, Jin has other trump cards up his sleeve. Specifically the first battle stance of the Spearmaster, the Lightning Cut. This blow is a bit like a gunshot. It concentrates a huge amount of mana onto the sharp spear, then releases it instantly. Watching them fight, Caesar was truly thrilled. He had never seen someone so young fight on equal terms with Joker. Despite Joker only using a new C rank, even Walter recognized Jin's strength. But what impressed him the most was his superior spear wielding. Meanwhile, Jin didn't give the Joker the slightest opportunity to counterattack. He pelted him with a hail of attacks. If things continue like this, the testing will soon be over, and the Joker won't have time to complete his secret quest and lose his head. But it was not easy for the genie either. Fighting a B-rank warrior is very difficult, especially when he wants to kill you. But the biggest problem was that it was getting harder and harder to control mana. If there was a risk that holy power and mana could collide, noticing that Jin was getting weaker, Joker decided not to miss his chance and attacked him. The only one who can stop him is Agnes, but the distance between the Joker and the genie is too short for the Duke to react. Jin, at the last moment, managed to block, but it wasn't just a sword strike, it was a mountain-splitting strike. The Joker's signature move. Seeing this, Armstrong stood up and shouted, "Duke Agnes! Joker's mana is now above B rank. The Count is in danger." But the Duke was calm as a predator waiting for its prey. Turning around, he said, "Calm down and watch. It's not over yet, and indeed, this is just the beginning." Jin was able to block Joker's punch by concentrating all of his mana at the point of contact. Figuring Jin had weakened enough, the Joker decided to follow through. When Valmont saw this, he shouted across the training room, "Joker, what are you thinking? Stop this at once!" But it was too late. Suddenly, there was an explosion of incredible power, just like the one that had occurred during the battle between the genie and Babylon, only many times stronger. Everyone was looking forward to when the dust settled, and they would see what had really happened. After a moment, the dust slowly began to settle, and they saw that Jin was still on his feet. But that wasn't all. Jin was still standing there, but Joker was thrown backwards, and he struggled to stay on his feet. Well, what's more interesting is that Jin was able to awaken the true face of the Rugia. You might ask how that could happen. Well, if the impact of the mountain-cutting blow, Jin realized that he was one step away from losing, and then he had no choice but to try to summon the Rugia by force. Just like that, my hand once again saved Jin from death. Seeing the Rugia in Jin's hands, Chiefon turned pale and shouted out in a trembling voice, "This can't be, it's an artifact." Artifacts are weapons that can store and manipulate mana. When suddenly Caesar said, "Sir Valmont, that's enough. Even if Count Genie lacks experience, I think he is amazing." Seeing Jin unharmed after his attack, the Joker became furious. He decided to kill Jin in front of everyone. But then, Sir Valmont intervened and said the test was over. Valmont couldn't believe that Jin was able to block Joker's B-rank attack. After all, he had passed the C-rank test. Not even a Vermont could do that. However he felt about the genie, he recognized its power. Pointing his sword at the genie, Sir Valmont said, "Agreeable to His Majesty's order, from this moment on, the second son of the Duchy of Agnes is awarded the rank of C-rank knight. Raise His Majesty's sword." But Jin wasn't going to play along with this knight or anything, but he was going to faint a little more. Jin didn't want to show his weakness, so he raised a Rugia in honor. But that doesn't mean you think he abandoned his revenge plan. When suddenly Duke Agnes came up to the genie and asked if he was all right. On the Duke's face, there was real excitement. Jin had never seen such an expression in his previous life. Even though Jin could barely stand on his feet, he replied that he was fine. For the first time in the history of the Avalon Empire, no, the entire continent, it was the birth of Mana's youngest user. That night, the gathering was held in the Duchy of Agus. All the vassals came, and all the leaders of the duchy's knightly bands. And the reason why they gathered today was because the number of monsters appearing from the forest had increased greatly. To be precise, the main reason the knights came back was because of the Black Ogre. The Black Ogre is the strongest creature of the Dark Forest, also known as the Monster Sanctuary. A strong troll that tears bodies apart like paper, equal in strength to a mage of 4th level or higher. Also a knight of B rank or higher who can use a sword aura. When the vassals learned of this, they became very agitated, for it would leave the security of their domains in jeopardy. Since the only warrior more powerful than this ogre was Duke Agnes himself, he decided to take him on personally, now that the problem of the ogres has been solved. It's time to discuss one more issue regarding the 5 duchies. There was some other reason Cheryl and Cox were here, which the Duke wanted to talk to Armstrong about in person. And so, when all matters were settled, the Chiffon raised his hand, showing a desire to discuss one more matter. Rising from his chair, the Chiffon said, "I want to talk about Earl Gin. Until recently, no one remembered him. Besides, he was weak due to the mana curse. How someone like that could suddenly become a C-rank knight? It's hard to explain it with talent alone. In other words, I suspect that Count Jin is taking power from demons or monsters. I can't explain the situation otherwise." Even more suspicious was the weapon Jin was wielding. It had changed its shape, something only artifacts could do. All of this would have been considered mere luck if Chiffon hadn't sensed the genie's aura when he attacked the Joker. It was identical to the demons. Chiffon's arguments have convinced the vassals that Jin is dangerous. He should be taken as far away from the duchy as possible while they're at it. As unfortunate as it may sound, even holds to Agnes are not at liberty to reject the council's application. It seems that for Chiffon, things are looking up. In the eyes of the ducal elite, he and Babylon are in a better light. When suddenly, without a knock, the door to the study opened. And of course it was Jean. He walked into the office like he was in his own room, not saying hello to anyone and looking down on everyone. But walking past the Chiffon, he stopped for a second and whispered, "Demons. If my power is so suspicious, why don't you check it out personally?" Hearing this, Chiffon shouted indignantly, "Insolent! What did you just say?" Jin laughed and said, "You should be able to determine whether or not I really borrowed my demon power if you accuse me of that. Am I not right?" But the Chiffon is unable to do so, because then with his sword, he will spill the blood of the man whose veins bleed into his master, and then he would be in a lot of trouble. Jin decided to make him even angrier by saying, "Why are you so hesitant?" Saying, "Why are you so hesitant, scared?" I have to admit, if he wanted to piss off the Chiffon, he did a pretty good job of it. But it had to be admitted that Jean had really overstepped his bounds. Seeing where this was going, Duke Agnes ordered them both to calm down. There's one thing that everyone overlooked, Chiffon included. One of the most experienced warriors of the Imperial Order was testing the genie's mana. So if Jin used the power of a demon or a monster, that Joker would definitely notice it. It was for this reason that Duke Agnes decided to close the issue with Jin by convincing his vassals that Jin does not use the power of demons. And now, the Chiffon is in an even worse position than it was before. But Jean, that doesn't mean we've cleared everything up. There are still things we are not sure about. It's all about what everyone was worried about. Jin's sudden awakening of powers. And by everyone, I mean literally everyone from vassals to Agnes. So to sort things out, Jin goes with the Duke into the Dark Forest. Right after returning from the Dark Forest, the Duke was going to send the genie to the Imperial Capital Academy. No matter what anyone else thinks of him, his talent is undeniable. And according to the rules of the Agnes family, the Duke will give him a chance. Chiffon was well aware that at the Imperial Academy, he would be out of it by virtue of reach. And if he came back stronger, Babylon would be drawn into a war of succession, which it was very likely to lose. And at that moment, Chiffon realized that he had to kill Jin, no matter what it cost him. Well before he went into the dark woods with the Duke, Jin had a favor to ask. He wants to go to the capital with his mom. The more Jean talked, the more the Chiffon got the impression that Jean was playing with him, like a predator before it ate its prey. As suddenly the Chiffon said, "My lord, I am a little anxious about the probability of your exalting Lady lose." Before Chiffon could finish, the Duke agreed to Jin's request. Over the past few days, the Duke has realized more and more how unique Jin is as a child. Even Babylon wasn't like this when he was his age. The meeting was over. The only unresolved issue was the Fonte family's accounts, which Armstrong would have to report on tonight. And to their meeting, the Count also invited Jean. When all of a sudden Babylon walks into the office and screams, "Excuse me, wait!" The thing is, the Duke invited both Jeannie and Babylon to today's meeting, so they could learn the craft of management. But Babylon was late. He was prepared to be punished for his mistake. But in his defense, he said that he had been practicing and hadn't kept track of the time. Looking at Babylon, the Duke noticed that he had also changed. Even in the air around him is different. As suddenly Duke Agnes said, "You've come to say something. What is it that you want?" "Yes, my lord. I have something to say to Count Jin," replied Babylon. Jin thought it was funny. Therefore a sincere smile appeared on his face. When Jian saw it, he went crazy and shouted, "The Count of Babylon has a higher position in society. This is a public place, so mind your manners." Jin listened to all this hysterical yelling and said, "Since when did you become a representative of Babylon? You've always behaved like his obedient dog. You became an honorary raven only because of Duke Agnes. Remember who is your master. In any case, a chiffon must never show favor to one side of his heritage, otherwise he will be banished." And he understood that very well. So he replied, "You misunderstood. I just corrected you, because I thought you didn't know about such norms of behavior." At that moment, the smile from the genie's face disappeared, and then he said, "Anyone can rise up the career ladder as long as his skills are with him. If you want to be heard, first prove yourself worthy. If you think this is another attempt to hurt the chiffon, you're wrong. It's one of the laws of the Duchy of Agnes." When suddenly Babylon intervened in the conversation instead and said, "Sir Chiffon, you shouldn't do that. It's okay. Not so long ago a child full of vanity. Now the look in his eyes resembles that of a true knight." This is what Babylon has become. And this could not but please Agnes. So Babylon came here to tell his wife that he remembered his words, and promised that he would soon surpass Jin in strength. Jin also noticed that since the last time they had met, Babylon's gaze had become completely different. As suddenly Babylon said, "Duke Father, from now on I would like to give up my place as heir." When the chiffon heard that, it almost gave him a heart attack. Outraged by this decision, because Babylon is the Duke's legitimate son. Sighing heavily, the Duke asked, "Son, have you lost your confidence due to the manifestation of a stronger opponent?" "Of course not. According to the rules of House Agnes, I want to observe a fair fight," replied Babylon. What an asshole Babylon used to be to me. This is an act of respect, and the Duke has promised to consider his appeal. Now this meeting is really over. In the last couple weeks, the duchy has changed a lot. I don't know what it will end up being, but I have a good feeling about it. Immediately after the meeting was over, the chiffon went to Duchess Vanessa's room and told her that her son had renounced his inheritance. But she was even more angry that Lucia would go to the capital, and she would stay here. A little calmed, Vanessa said in a trembling voice, "Chiffon, don't blame yourself. I know as well as anyone how straight Babylon is. Just like his father, you wouldn't do anything. I'm confident in my son's abilities. But right now the most important thing is that Jean doesn't take the inheritance for himself." "I'm going to have to. Tell that person in our situation," Vanessa added. Hearing this, Chiffon became agitated and said, "I think there's no point, Jin. Tomorrow we'll go together with the Duke Forbidden Territory." But Vanessa wasn't convinced, especially since Lucia was going to the capital instead. Considering all things considered, Vanessa asked the chiffons to tell the Count that she would like to dine with him. The next morning, the Imperial Knights began to leave the territory of the Duchy of Agnes. Back a couple hours ago, the Duke invited Jin to another audience, where he asked him to forget that he was a member of the Agnes family. All because the Duke decided to give the genie something very interesting. Namely, the Ring of Dawn, which the Duke received as a reward of salvation in a magical tower. This Ring of Dawn, when infused with mana, immediately equips the wearer with armor. Funny thing is, this ring was previously reserved exclusively for the heir to the duchy. But in this case, it's an exception. Which is why the Duke asked Jin to forget about being Agnes, because he doesn't want Jin to get hurt. Also, Agnes only gives this ring to the genie for a while. By the way, another very fascinating fact. The armor that appears when mana interacts with the ring has each family's distinctive insignia on it. It's to hide your identity from people in the neighborhood. And since Jean had to forget he was Agnes, he has to make up a new name for himself. Must be the same reason the genie has to hide his identity as the reason the Duke lent him the ring. When suddenly, the smile disappeared from the Duke's face, and he said, "Jean, tell me honestly, do you hold a grudge against me?" That's actually a pretty tough question. The witch didn't know whether he resented the Duke or not. Even Duke Agnes could not expect to die in vain in a war between empires, which would take place 10 years from now. I guess if you pick a reason why Jin might hold a grudge against him, so it's because he left his mother unprotected, which is why she died. In his past life, Jin had only seen the Dukes a couple times, so he slowly forgot about this grudge. They say time heals. Surprisingly, but during the time that Jin had time to spend with the Duke, our hero began to have warm feelings for him. When suddenly Caesar came up to him and said, "You look like something good happened, Jean." "Or should I call you Sir Gin?" Caesar added. To the prince, rumors had reached him that the Duke was going to send Jin to the academy. So he asked that Jin come to see him upon his arrival. The thing is, Caesar wanted Jin as his personal knight. It's just like in his previous life. In other words, after using the privileges, Jin will be able to leave the academy early. As suddenly, Caesar laughed and said, "I want you to know, I don't usually make such generous offers." This laughter, mixed with pretense and hypocrisy, is truly disgusting. If it weren't for Caesar's guards, Jin would have stabbed him in the neck a long time ago. Anyway, the genie needs to join the Order of Imperial Knights to get another favorite weapon from his past life, which you only get once a year, and that's as a battalion commander. But for now, Jin preferred to focus on the task at hand in the dark forest. He promised to give an answer later. This order of things, a more than satisfactory principle. So he ordered Sir Velmont to pack for home. Watching Jin walk off into the distance, the prince smiled and said, "He's funny, but he's going to be mine anyway." Caesar has no idea what the future holds. Jin, on the other hand, was determined not to make the mistakes he made last time. Expedition to the Black Forest, led by Duke Agnes, was soon formed. Above all, the expedition consisted of a rather small group for a group led by the Duke. It was just a group from the Order of Crimson Knights and Armand, the only fourth-class mage in the Duchy of Agnes, and of course Babylon and Jean. Before going into the Dark Forest, the Duke arrived with the others at the castle of the Forbidden Territory, which is just before entering the Dark Forest, and ruling this castle was a warrior named Robin. He was a former senior knight of the Clover Knights of Hertz Agnes. Robin had served House Agnes for decades. Agnes and Robin were old friends, for Robin remembered Agnes as a child. Agnes even felt a certain guilt towards him, for he had sent his faithful warrior to the very edge of the duchy. As suddenly the main gate of the manor opened, a fat man and a young girl stepped out of it. The fat man's name was Vigo. He was the lord of the Forbidden Territory, and at the same time, Vanessa's relatives. And the girl's name was Inna. She was Vigo's only daughter. Every meeting between Agnes and Vigo for Herzen ended in a huge disaster, and a whole lot of problems. When suddenly Vigo shouted, "Robin, you've lost your mind with age! Why didn't you inform me that the Duke was in town?" How can you be so inexperienced, after all these years of service? How can you be responsible for guarding this place with such a feeble mind, and listen to it all as a humble servant? Wouldn't listen to his old friend being humiliated. So the Duke said, "Vigo, I see you've adapted quickly to life here. Every time we meet, you get bigger and bigger." Vigo pulled a nasty smile on his face and rubbed his fat hands like a fly, pretending that the Duke's words flattered him. Watching everything from the sidelines, Jean couldn't figure out if Vigo was a fool or just unscrupulous. When suddenly Vigo cried out, "My God, Count Babylon is here too!" The food was so strong that even I, who was not an expert, could feel it. Looking at Jin, Vigo's face changed drastically. It became even nastier. As suddenly he said, "By the way, who is this one here?" "Lord Vigo, this is Count Jin, the second son of Duke Agnes," answered Chipon. When he heard this, Vigo was a little embarrassed, bowed his head to the Duke, and said, "Where are my manners? I am sorry, my lords. It takes a long time for news to reach me. I did not know that my sister—" Before he could finish his sentence, the chiffon told him that Jin was a bastard. When he heard that, Vigo's smile disappeared from his face and his gaze became that of a serial killer. Looking at Jin, he suddenly shouted, "So you filthy brat!" The Duke was holding himself back from separating Vigo's head from his body right now, when suddenly the Duke shouted, "Knights, let us go on our way. There's nothing more for us to do here." For some reason, Vigo showed a desire to go with the Duke into the Dark Forest, justifying this desire by saying that he is lord of these lands and must also take part in the slaughter of the monsters, especially since he had a whole troop of first-rate warriors under Robin, and since he can't leave his daughter alone, he wants to take her with him into the dark woods. Upon learning of this, the Duke was outraged that Vigo wanted to take his daughter to such a dangerous place. When suddenly, Inna came up to Agnes and said, "Duke, let me come with you. I can be of use to you." And to prove it, the girl started creating spells. It was filled with a strong magical energy, another genius in the Duchy of One. Well, what's most amazing is that she was able to summon a spirit named Selphida. When Armand saw this, he couldn't contain his surprise and shouted, "Unbelievable! It's a spirit!" Inna, and she only found out she could summon spirits a couple weeks ago. As with magic, only those who have been predisposed from birth can use the spiritual arts. In fact, sages are even rarer than mages. Most kingdoms don't even have 100, counting from the weakest. I didn't expect to find such a unique person in a place like this. Well, the interesting thing is that in his past life, Jin had never heard of a sage named Inna. But she looks familiar to him. Seeing Inna's strength, the Duke allowed Vigo and his army to join the battle. But he also ordered that his troops try not to get involved in the fight. Given Agnes's ambitions, the arrival of a wise man in his duchy is most welcome. For a while, Jin will be with Inna, so he'll have time to think about where he might have seen her before. And if she's really important, he'll remember. When all of a sudden Vigo said, "Hey you trash! Know that I'm watching you. And don't even think about doing anything I don't like." Meanwhile, Caesar and the Emperor's delegation already back in the capital. The prince's handler told the Emperor the whole battle in detail, without missing a single detail. The Emperor was very surprised that Jin was able to block Joker's attacks while still being able to counterattack him. Suddenly, the Emperor said, "Evergrande, what do you think of him? I want your opinion, not as an Imperial knight, but as the best mage in the Empire. As I told you, as a mage it's hard for me to judge. Knights and mages use mana differently," replied the Evergrande. Emperor was most interested in the feelings that Jin's mana evoked in him. He wanted to understand the young count's potential. Sighing heavily, Evergrande added, "Instead of giving an abstract answer, I'll try to explain with the help of Imperial knights. I'd take Sir Valmont as an example. I haven't fought him yet, but if it was a one-on-one battle, there's no way I'd lose. Even though Valmont has become the youngest captain of the battalion and is one of the most prominent men in the Empire, Evergrande surpasses him by leaps and bounds." As suddenly the magician excitedly said, "But Count Jin is very different from Sir Valmanthus. Of course, he can't beat me now, but I felt that if he continued training in 10 or even maybe 5 years, he could beat me." Just the kind of answer the Emperor expected to hear. And then Marcus asked Evergrande, what would be the outcome of the battle if they fought each other? Mage left this question unanswered. After all, they both knew perfectly well that Evergrande, without much trouble, could win. And then a smile appeared on Marcus's face and he said, "That's funny. I shouldn't have sent Caesar to Agnes. I should have gone myself. He should see this guy for himself." When suddenly the Emperor snapped his fingers, and a second later, a translucent man in a robe appeared in front of him. He was the Emperor's personal spy named Jakin. The Emperor had ordered that Jin should live in the palace for a while, under the Emperor's supervision. Bowing his head, Jakin said, "My lord, as far as I know, the fourth principal is already preparing for this." Marcus was very surprised to hear that. Not long ago, a letter of recommendation from the fourth prince was delivered by the Imperial Knights, and it was addressed to the genie. On a letter of recommendation, one could get into the 11th or 12th battalion. The Emperor didn't like them much, for they were a motley collection of men, more like bandits than soldiers of the Empire. After a couple of minutes of deliberation, the Emperor said, "Caesar, well done. But here is Guin von Agnes. If he's really that strong and talented, he might be a good fit." Meanwhile, Duke Agnosu's expedition had made a small camp just before the entrance to the Dark Forest. Duke Agnes, together with Robin, Chiffon, and his sons, were working out a plan of action for tomorrow. Well, here, with his opinion, Lord Vigo decided to step in. He thought it was very dangerous to camp right at the entrance to the Dark Forest. You may have wondered why Vigo is so brash, even in the presence of the Duke. But he is Duchess Vanessa's own brother, so he's often overreaching. And then Agnes couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "You idiot, have you even listened to me? You can tell how this forest works just by looking at it." Duke was talking about how the monsters start attacking as soon as night falls. Monsters come out of the woods like cockroaches. They're also especially ruthless under a red moon. But there are problems, and serious ones at that. The intervals between their attacks are getting shorter and shorter, which scares the townspeople a lot. In short, the speed is darker, so the monsters will come out of the forest, so there is no need to go there. And in order to keep Vigo from sticking his nose into military affairs, the Duke ordered him to help him set up a camp for the others. And Genie and Babylon, he's put them on night duty. They would be responsible for detecting monsters. But while it was still dark, Jin joined the common soldiers in gathering wood for the fire. But Jin didn't come here out of the goodness of his heart. After waiting for the soldiers to leave, Jin decided to practice a bit, along with Rugja. And for that, he's headed into the middle of the woods. This would be Jin's first real fight in his new life, and Lord Vigo followed him as promised. A Kinesis stone is a magically enhanced artifact that contains the power of creation. It is believed that there is a Genesis stone for each of the elements: water, fire, wind, lightning, ice, and others. But only 5 of them have been discovered. At this time, all 5 have still not been found. The Genesis Stone can strengthen a level 1 magic circle to a level 3 magic circle. Not only magic but also knights want to possess it, and one of the stones is in the deepest part of the dark forest. Knowing this, Jin went in search of it, for with this stone he would be able to control his excess power. But the genie had been in the woods for over an hour now, so the Count's long absence had clearly been noticed by now. So, Gina decided to head back to camp and continue the search tomorrow, when suddenly the ground beneath his feet began to vibrate. And the reason the earth shook was a huge black ogre. Luckily, this time the monster didn't see our hero, and Jin had time to hide. With the arrival of the black ogre, there are a number of serious problems. First, there is no way to get past him to the center of the forest. Second, the low-level magic that Jin possesses won't work on him. You have to be a B-rank knight to defeat it, but black ogres always go one at a time. If Jin can infuse Rugia with the same energy as on the test, he can kill him in seconds. He has no margin for error. If Jin can't win with one punch, he's in big trouble. Seconds before Jin's attack, the ogre stopped abruptly and began to growl, awakening all the monsters around it. It seems like an ordinary growl, but even Jin is affected by it with tremendous pressure. While Gina tried to resist the pressure, the ogre turned around in seconds and pointed his fist in the direction of our hero. Jin was well aware that if he didn't dodge this attack, he would die. In what must have been a moment of death, our hero was able to suppress the ogre's pressure and jump back. His power was far greater than Janet had imagined, and since the monster had already smelled Jin, our hero had no choice but to run, and run very fast. Running away from ogre, Jin found himself in a small field where he noticed a red moon in the sky that he couldn't see before because of the dense trees. Now, it's clear why the monster was able to sense Jinayu's presence. Because of the red moon, the monster's strength, speed, and all of its stats have increased many times over, so there is no way to run away from it. But it is quite possible to hide if you carefully cover all the tracks. And then, Jin remembered the technique taught to him by his old friend, the King of Assassins. Our hero certainly lacks practice, but it is still worth a try. Instead of concentrating mana on the monsters, Jin maneuvered like a stream of air, blending in with his surroundings. By mixing his mana with nature's mana, Jin became completely invisible to the monster's eyes. Running away from the orc, Jin got too far from the camp, so he decided to continue his journey to the center of the forest in search of the magic stone. When suddenly, on his way, Jin met a squad of goblins reinforced by the red moon. At first glance, it might seem like Jin has a huge problem, but this is the perfect opportunity to try something out, namely, the second stage of spear wielding. A gust of wind that creates a tornado of incredible power around its user. For ordinary goblins, such an attack proved to be an insurmountable barrier. Although Jin was able to use the second stance, but it still causes a strong recoil and drains his body a lot.
Jin thought he was ready for stage 2, but no. He can't even release half of his power, all because of his weak body.
But Jin can't waste any time resting, because judging by the direction the monsters are heading towards the camp, and soon they'll meet up with the knights. But even so, Jin still decided to continue his search for the Genesis Stone. Meanwhile, the knights in camp were dealing with the usual domestic problems. But it didn't last long, for a moment later the monsters appeared. The goblins managed to take the knights by surprise. After all, they expected to meet them in a couple of hours. Babylon, along with all the soldiers, fought like a true knight, and it must be said that he was quite good at it. Weak goblins were no big problem for him, let alone Cain, who decapitated over 30 goblins in a matter of minutes. Watching the Cain, Babylon was greatly surprised, for he didn't think that there was someone so strong in the ranks of the Crimson Knights. And just when it looked like they'd fought off the monsters, more monsters came out of the forest than the first time. One of the Crimson Knights shouted, "There are at least 1,000 of them. We must retreat immediately." And then a chiffon enters the fray and says, "Shut up. Anyone who goes to the camp will be executed. Crimson Knights, build a line and prepare for battle." In the battle, literally everyone was involved. The battle was very successful, of course not without casualties. And warriors like Babylon, Cain, and Chiffon were able to hold back a whole 1,000 monsters. But even so, the monsters kept getting bigger and bigger. And all because of the moon, which turns ordinary monsters into killing machines. And it seemed like it couldn't get any worse as a black ogre came out of the woods. Chiffon was a small B-rank knight in this part of the camp, so he felt it was his duty to kill him, even at the cost of his own life. But unfortunately, all of Chiffon's attacks failed. The ogre repeatedly fought them off. Eventually, the chiffon fell to the floor, completely exhausted and badly wounded. At the sight of the black ogre, the regular soldiers started to run away, but you can't blame them for that. It would be suicide to fight this thing alone. Chiffon was in a real panic because of this ogre. He didn't understand how such a large monster could be so fast, as suddenly, from behind someone said, "Knights must not lose their composure no matter what the situation is. And that big guy, I'll take care of him." At last, Duke Agnes has cleared his side of the camp and come to the rescue. Now he's the only one in the camp who can handle a monster like the Black Ogre. But before dealing with the Black Ogre, Duke Moore has a whole bunch of simple monsters to defeat. Sometimes you forget how strong Duke Agnes is. With a single swing of his sword, he scattered all the monsters within a radius of 30 meters. To think he could take out 100 monsters with one punch. This is the true power of one of the 9 stars of the continent, Master Agnes. Meanwhile, Jin has already reached the heart of the dark forest where the Genesis Stone is to be kept. When Babylon saw his father's strength, he was shocked, or rather he was frightened, because he'd never seen Duke Agnes in battle before. He had no idea he was so strong. When suddenly, Lord Vigo said, "Commander Chiffon, where is that bastard that was with you?" "You don't know, but I'll tell you. He ran away like a brazen coward. That's why you can't mess with trash like his mother and him," added the Lord. Rumors of Jin's escape quickly spread throughout the camp. The reputation of our hero, in the eyes of ordinary soldiers, plummeted. Seeing the commotion in the ranks, Duke Agnes cried out, "What are you doing? The battle is not over yet!" Thanks to the battle spirit given to him, Babylon led a whole squad of warriors into battle, forcing the ordinary goblins to flee. As a friend, goblins began to emerge from the forest, though it's more accurate to say someone threw them out of there, and the reason for that was a whole group of huge black ogres. Which is surprising because they usually go one at a time. To defeat one such monster is quite a feat, let alone 5. A normal soldier would never survive an encounter with such a monster, so most of them began to retreat. Of war, the Order of the Crimson Knights fought like true lions, unafraid of certain death. But all their efforts were in vain, as suddenly, Chiffon felt the presence of incredibly strong mana, and when he looked up, he saw Jin hovering just above the black ogre's head. But what's more interesting is that when Jin's spear touched the monster, a huge force of lightning came out, thereby knocking a giant ogre to the ground. I don't think it's worth explaining that Jin found a lightning bolt and a Genesis Stone in the forest. The entire camp saw it, and no one could believe their eyes that Jin was able to kill the Red Moon-enhanced ogre with a single blow. In the camp, there was a sepulchral silence as Lord Vigo shouted, "What was that just now? What a trick! You just showed up at the right moment. I saw with my own eyes that it was the Duke who killed the monster with one blow. And you had nothing to do with it. But now's not the time to figure out what happened. We need to at least survive first." This time, Jin didn't stand aside either, and rushed forward in the vanguard of the attack. Because of the high compatibility, Jin can now harness the power of the Bronto Genesis Stone to some extent. But it's hard to say how long his body will last. However, it's not that important. Right now, Jin should try to kill as many monsters as possible, and if his body still can't take it, Duke Agnes will protect him. And by the way, absorbing Bronto's power opened up many new possibilities for the genie, one of which was the lightning whirlwind technique, which, in one blow, took the lives of 2 black ogres. It's a miracle to defeat one, but to defeat 2 in one blow. As the genie suspected, his body was still too weak to use such a technique. The recoil was too great. Now, the ordinary warriors had no doubts that it was Jin who could defeat the black ogre. But they had even more questions. After all, using mana with elemental elements was something new. Some even began to think that Jin was a magical swordsman, the rarest and most dangerous kind of warrior. Watching the genie, Duke Agnes couldn't understand how after such attacks he could still stand on his feet. When suddenly, Armand came up to the Duke and said, "It was incredible. I can see why you'd be following him. I'm not sure about the knight's rank, but as a mage, he's stronger than a 3rd-class master. Young Count Jin is a real monster who can change the entrance of the country's history," Armand added. Without listening to his aide, Duke Agnes ran to the genie's aid with lightning speed, because our hero had exhausted his body to the point where he passed out at the feet of a giant black ogre. The Duke, in a matter of moments, butchered the monster like a true butcher, leaving it no chance. To give you an idea of the speed at which he did it, Jin didn't even have time to hit the ground. Well, you can rest easy now, knowing he's in good hands. Closing his eyes, Jin could hear heartbreaking screams asking for help. And opening his eyes with the last of his strength, Jin saw Duke Agnes's palace on fire. So what is this? Just a nightmare due to fatigue or the future? But everything felt too realistic for a dream. Suddenly, Jin saw a man coming out of the burning palace. When he looked closely, he saw the sword of Duke Agnes in the man's hands. But when the man came fully into the light, he saw that it was Babylon, only grown up. All this will indeed happen, but it won't happen for another 10 years. For it was Babylon, in a previous life, that defeated the Duchy of Agnes. Apparently, because of the power of the Bronto, Jean had a dream. Even in a past life, the Genesis Stones have been poorly researched, but their power may be enough to allow their owner to see the future. As suddenly, Jin felt a strong gust of wind that attacked Babylon. Could it be that in the future, someone will find a Genesis Stone with the element of wind? What a twist! Now I see why Inna seemed so familiar to the genie. In the future, she would possess a high-class wind spirit. Jin, with great interest, watched everything that was going on. After all, he did not know many details about the fall of the Duchy of Agnes. But unfortunately, Jin couldn't understand what they were saying. It was as if they were speaking in an unknown language, but the Genesis Stone had its limitations. As to take his hand, another man appeared, but he spoke. He spoke in another language, not the same as Babylon and Babylon. It's getting weirder by the minute. Jin decided to fly a little closer to them, due to the fact that he couldn't see the stranger's face. As Jin got closer, he finally began to realize what they were talking about. As suddenly Babylon cried out with wild fury in his voice, "Do you think Agnes will kneel, and for some organization?" Although he could make out Babylon's words, Jin couldn't understand the stranger's words. As suddenly Inna's spiritual lion attacked Babylon, leaving him wounds that fit with life. This whole situation has put the genie in a stupor. It was thought that Babylon had been a traitor to the duchy, and had been executed by the Night Emperor. And then it was the stranger who finally showed his face, and Jin recognized him because they'd met him in a previous life. And his name, Darksha, was driving Grace. Just as suddenly, Jin woke up in a hospital bed in the duchy. He had no doubt in his mind that it was an unusual dream, but how much of it was true was unclear. Jin wondered just how long he had spent unconscious. Trying to let up, Jin felt a terrible pain throughout his body. Apparently, his body was still unable to withstand such stresses as when using the lightning vortex. But thanks to this, Jin was able to reach the second stage in spear magic. This stage's strength was comparable to the skills of the best C-ranked knights. However, the strength that Jin showed against the monster was able to resist even B-ranked knights at the initial stage. Most likely, it is because of Bronto, to which the element of lightning belongs. In addition to this, if things sleep is also the power of Bronto. Then we need to learn more about the Genesis Stones before the others find out about them. When suddenly, as if by magic, the Duke found himself next to Jin's bed, as he suddenly said, "Isn't it amazing? The moon, which seemed to have swallowed up the whole world just a few hours ago, is right now studying the beautiful blue color. We'll head to the academy as soon as we get back to the duchy. As I said, you will not be Gin von Agnes. Henceforth, you are the only son of the fallen Frederick Viscount," added the Duke. "Now you'll have to adjust to the new word. It won't do any good to have Jin as the center of attention anyway. But right now, the most important thing is to regain his former strength." When suddenly, Hertz became visibly nervous. Then he asked Jin what he knew about the man whose name he had spoken in the dream. Duke was very insistent on this question. He wanted to know how Jin knew Darksia led Greys, but Jin pretends not to understand what the Duke is asking him. He just said he had a nightmare. Duke believed Jin, so he left his resting place for Jin to gain strength before leaving. Meanwhile, in the castle's secret room, Locke, Lord Vigo, and Chiffon were plotting something. Them both was very much concerned about the precarious position of the Earl of Babylon in the race for the inheritance, and them included. But what worried Vigo even more was Jin's sudden and unexpected appearance of power. He, like many others, think Jin sold his soul to the devil in exchange for unlimited power. On the phone, tried to convince him of this, because Jin had passed all the tests and competitions, and not just anyone, but Imperial knights. When suddenly Vigo said, "Chiffon, you disappoint me. It doesn't matter if Jin got his power from the demon or not." Chiffon, he understood the Lord's thinking immediately, and vowed to do everything in his power to destroy Jin. In turn, Lord Vigo will send his daughter Inna to the academy to keep an eye on the genie and report back. I think you should know the purpose of Miss Sherilyn Cox's visit to the Duchy of Agnes. The Fonte house had long been in competition with Cromwell County, but everything was within the law. Like any conflict, it escalated over time. The King of Mercenaries took the side of Cromwell County, which is why Sherilyn Cox came to Duke Agnes. Mercenary King Bavariant was the first swordsman in the Empire to reach A rank. He was not just an outstanding individual who peaked in axe handling. He's one of 12 superhumans who could compete for a place in the 9 stars if he wanted to. The problem was that there were rumors that he was secretly collaborating with Cromwell County. Cromwell County had great influence in the Empire. They were second only to House Font. And since both Cromwell and Fonda were engaged in trade, they might soon be at war over land. Even though it's only a rumor, the Font family decided to be reassured. But just asking for help is not enough. For this reason, Cheryl had to marry Babylon. Even though the Imperial Palace forbids wars over lands without reason, Cromwell isn't acting with his own hands. So Font needs protection anyway. Suddenly Cox said, "For me, protecting the house is one of my most important missions. However, I cannot allow my mistress to live with someone she does not want to, in order to please the county. Although I'm not an expert, it seemed to me that your feelings for Count Jin were sincere. So I want to dare to ask Duke Agnes to marry Count Jin." Cox's act had Cheryl very upset, because she had really fallen in love with Jean. There is no talk of a wedding yet, but Cox has promised to do his best to arrange a dinner for the two of them as soon as the Duke and his sons return home. The Duke and his army returned near sundown, practically at night, the day the Order of the Crimson Knights returned from the Forbidden Lands. It was the first time in a long time that a great feast had been held in the Duchy of Agnes. All the soldiers were celebrating their return, and discussing the battle won as to who had killed the most monsters. Kane asks our hero, "Can a lord, who is the hero of today, leave the party like that?" Jin smiled and replied, "You call me lord so naturally. If someone hears it, they'll make a fuss, don't you think? But I'm not just saying that. Thanks to today, I can already say with certainty that I will serve you as my lord," Kane added. This made the genie laugh a lot, and then he said, "And he didn't even ask me. And if I refuse my knightly duty? I am sure that my lord is such a fool as to refuse me a subordinate who will become a master in the future," replied the Kane. Kane was much more promising and ambitious than he first appeared. But that's not a bad thing. Jin let Kane go to the feast, and decided to go and rest a bit, to recover from the battle. In his past life, there were also many people who wanted to serve the Tyre, but he politely refused them all. All his life he wanted to be the Emperor's sword, so he felt that if he had subordinates, Caesar would trust him less. So Jean refused those people. But he still doesn't understand why Caesar did that, because until his last breath, that it was all a mistake. When suddenly from the other end of the corridor came a hoarse voice that said, "Well, ship, are you feeling unwell? Shall I call a doctor?" Turning around, the genie saw the old wise man who oversees order in the duchy. Jin assured him that he was fine, and as he was about to leave, the monk stopped him and said, "Food has been prepared for you. Everyone is waiting for you. It's not about the feast. Dinner has been prepared by order of Duchess Vanessa. Your mother, Lady Lucia, is also there," the sage added. The news made Jean's heart pound with anger, because he knew from his previous life how cunning Duchess Vanessa could be. Upon hearing about the dinner, Jin immediately arrived there. There was no one else in the dining room besides Chifrin, Duchess Vanessa, and his mom. Lucia and Jin were madly happy to see each other. They hadn't seen each other since Jin had moved to the Duke's palace. And then, with a slight cough, Duchess Vanessa drew attention to herself and said, "You're a Jin? This is the first time we've seen each other, isn't it?" Before Jin could reply anything, the chiffon said, "Count Jin, please follow your manners. She is the Duke's consort, the Duchess." But the genie simply remained silent and looked at the chiffon with a look as if he was about to tear him apart. At this moment, Chiffon felt a wild suppression. It was so strong that it could compare to the Duke's suppression. When suddenly Lucia said, "Son, be polite and introduce yourself to the Duchess." Turning to the Duchess, Jean bowed his head and said, "I am Jean von Agnes. Greetings to Duchess Vanessa." Vanessa was furious that Jean had introduced himself as Agnes, for she thought him a scum unworthy of life. But she didn't show it in public, only joked that she wanted to meet the genie before he left for the capital. Hearing this, Lucia said with a tremor in her voice, "I beg your pardon, you said capital, you mean Acadia?" "Oh, so you have not heard it yet?" replied the Duchess. Count Jin was recognized as a C-rank knight, so the Duke said he would take him with him to the Academy of Acadia, added the chiffon. Upon learning that Jean had become a knight, Lucione couldn't contain her joy and shouted, "Son, I'm so proud of you!" And then Vanessa said, "That's why I've gathered today to celebrate. I'm sorry that I couldn't take care of you earlier. I hope with this meeting we will forget about our offenses." Lucy, confused to hear this, tried to convince the Duchess that she held no grudges against her. I must say Vanessa really did her best. The dinner was delicious. All kinds of meat and everything you could possibly want. But of course it was for a reason. Lucy's steak was poisoned. It was too arrogant to believe that Vanessa really wanted a reconciliation. When all of a sudden, Jean stood up and said, "Just a second. Before we get to the meal, I'd like to apologize. To apologize for not greeting you earlier, Duchess. Even though you care so much about my mom and me." "Come on, you're just a kid. Don't think about it and start eating," Vanessa replied. "Don't take this the wrong way, but I can't do that, even with all of this prepared especially for us," Jin added. "Mother, I think the Duchess cares for us too much. She has almost no food, while we have delicacies for every taste." Jin immediately figured out Vanessa's cunning plan. His past life had tried to kill him thousands of times, in many different ways. I don't think it's a stretch to say that poison was among them. As soon as Jin saw the food Vanessa had provided, he felt a hint of ponderosa. Ponderosa pine, it's a kind of poison pine, very rare, and incredibly similar to rosemary, so I'm quite often confused. But the Duchess wasn't stupid either. She knew right away that Jin smelled poison in their food. When suddenly Jin said, "Let's be honest, why did you poison our food?" Upon hearing this, the chiffon literally went wild and shouted, "You insolent man! How do you talk to the Duchess? You dare suspect her of poisoning the food? It's disrespectful!" And again Jin cast that will-crushing look at the chiffon. And he said, "Disrespect? The only one being disrespected here is you. Who do you think I am?" But the chiffon remained silent. He tried to beat the pressure Jean had put on him, to no avail. And I was only joking. But judging by Sir Chiffon's reaction, it seems to be more than a joke. "What do you say to that?" Jean added. And then the Duchess couldn't take it anymore and screamed, "You scum! You chiffon!" Drawing his sword, the chiffon said, "Insulting a nobleman is punishable by immediate execution, according to the laws of the Empire, even though you have my lord's blood in you." Taking out a Rugia, Jin devilishly shouted in a voice, "You dare to raise your sword at me?" "I can't turn a blind eye to the Ponderosa, or to what just happened here," Jin added. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, give it a like and write the word SPEAR in the comments. See you soon, and thanks for staying with me.